Okay, welcome. This is Real Talk with Sundiata Kaita Chajua. Today we have two special guests, historian Scott Kuroshiga and Augusto Espiritu. And we're going to be discussing anti-Asian terrorism and building solidarity between African Americans and the Asian community, the Asian American community. So let me bring on our guest. All right, Dr. Scott Kuroshiga is chair of comparative race and ethnic studies at Texas Christian University, and he is the immediate past president, the previous president, and the previous president-elect of the American Studies Association for 2018 to 2021. Scott is the author of several books, including The Shifting Grounds of Race, Princeton Press 2008, and that book specifically deals with African American and Japanese American relations in post-war Los Angeles. A couple of his other works is The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century, which he co-authored with the legendary Grace Lee Boggs. And he most recently published The 50-Year Rebellion, How the U.S. Political Crisis Began in Detroit. And that work was published with the University of California Press in 2017. Pleased to have you, Scott, longtime comrade and friend. And our next guest is Dr. Augusto Espiritu. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Illinois, my colleague. He is the author of Five Faces of Exile, The Nation and Filipino American Intellectuals, published by Stanford University Press in 2005. And he is the co-author with F. Malanason, Filipino Studies, Palmistus of Notion and Diaspora, that was published by New York University Press in 2016. And so we're here to talk about the current surge in anti-Asian American violence. And I want to start with a fairly simple kind of question, so that individual communities in the US often have similar relations to each other that the US has as a whole toward the rest of the world. For example, Africa, Asia, South and Central America, the Caribbean, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. That is to say, they are unknowledgeable and often uncaring. So, can you educate us a bit about the history of the community with which you identify, as well as the general history of Asian Americans? And whoever wants to go first on that question.
Well, I guess I could go first. First of all, thank you, Cynthia, for inviting me to come to the program. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with Scott Kuroshiga. You guys have done such great work on Asian and African American relations, and in your own research as well. I identify with the Filipino American community. I myself was born in the Philippines. I grew up there. I'm an immigrant. I was 10 years old when I came here. And the Filipino American community has a long history in the United States. It's been around since the late 18th century. Louisiana was really the first place where Filipinos landed. We have a long history of immigration and a lot of workers, immigrant workers, service workers, farm workers, ship cooks and janitors for the U.S. Navy. And more recently, in the last 50 or 60 years or so, there's been more professional immigration, particularly, as many folks probably have heard of, Filipina nurses. In fact, this recent COVID time, the National Nurses United came out with a study. It said 1 out of every 3 registered nurses who died in fighting COVID in the hospitals were Filipino, and about half were people of color. Um, so we're part of that long history of immigration. Filipinos have also had a long history of colonialism. The Philippines was occupied, colonized by Spain for 400 years, by Japan for 4 years, by the United States for 50 years or more. And even today, there are new challenges to the Philippines, particularly, and now it's under severe or has a huge international foreign debt, now owed a lot to the EU, to China, Japan, as much as the United States. And I guess one last thing is that, there's also the Filipino American community has had a very long history of protest in this country, fighting for independence from the United States in the early 20th century. We fought for ending dictatorship in the Philippines. We fought for organizing farm workers' struggles in the 1960s. And to this today, I mean, we're still fighting to end a particularly dictatorial regime that's developing under Rodrigo Duterte right now. We have a journalist named Maria Ressa, who's become kind of like the symbol of that struggle for an end to suppression of freedom of speech. And so that's a little bit about my community.
Augusto, were you able to hear me?
No, I just.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My follow-up question to you was, would you say that the particularity of the Filipino experience conforms to a general pattern of the Asian American experience, or do you see it as especially distinct?
I think it has both. Certainly, it conforms to the history of Asian Americans arriving in the United States and then being targeted for anti-Asian immigration, anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence, which was leveled against the Chinese first, and then the Japanese, and then the Filipinos. The more that the immigrant populations grew, the more they became a target for stereotyping, racial profiling, and immigration labor exclusion. But at the same time, the Filipinos also were distinctly racialized from Chinese and Japanese, particularly because our country was seen to be a savage country. Brown peoples, primitives, indigenous peoples that are seen to be, uncivilized in a way that could not be said about the Chinese and Japanese immigrants per se. Had long histories of their own empires and kingdoms and dynasties and so forth.
Thank you, Augusto. And let me bring Scott in, and I'm going to Scott, the same question. Can you speak to the particularity of the Japanese American community And then can you talk about the ways in which it might also conform to the general pattern of anti-Asian racial oppression in the United States?
Sure. And thank you. Thank you for having me, Dr. Chaju, and taking on this really important topic. I'm a fourth generation Japanese American. So my great grandfather immigrated as a contract laborer. He was actually brought to Hawaii. It was still then the Kingdom of Hawaii. It wasn't U.S. territory at the time. It was a sovereign Hawaiian kingdom. To work on a sugar plantation as a contract laborer in 1889. On my mother's side, my grandfather came with my grandmother as a Buddhist priest in the 1920s, first to California, and then they ended up settling in Seattle, Washington, where my mother grew up. And the experience on that side was, of course, very different. The Hawaii Japanese Americans, for the most part, weren't forced into the concentration camps. Those on the West Coast were. And by this point, there had been some really important structures of racial discrimination that had been put in place for the Japanese American community. First of all, the right to become a naturalized citizen was banned to essentially all Asians. There was a Japanese American test case that went up to the Supreme Court called Ozawa versus US. And what the Supreme Court affirmed was that the 1790 Naturalization Act, which said you had to be a free white person to become a naturalized citizen, was constitutional, and Ozawa was not white. So,
can you give us the year of that Supreme Court decision?
That was 1922. There's also a long history of these racist acts being accompanied by denial. So, when Ozawa and Japanese immigrants were denied the right to become citizens, the Supreme Court says, well, we don't mean anything offensive by this. This is just about difference. We don't mean to imply that you're inferior. We're just saying you're not eligible to become a citizen. That eligibility, or that lack of eligibility to become a citizen, was really central to the 1924 Immigration Act, which was one of the most exclusive, restrictive immigration laws ever passed. It really set the standard for affirming the U.S. as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, one that could begin to assimilate the Southern and Eastern Europeans into whiteness, but only by drawing a very harsh line and not allowing any Asians to migrate or become citizens. So that law in 1924 was actually something that Hitler admired. The Nazis cited it as basically a precedent for their race purity ideologies and the types of policies they would pursue. And it's been cited by a number of right-wing political figures, Stephen Miller, for example, as what the U.S. should return to, right? So when some of these folks talk about making America great again, they're really talking about returning to an era governed by these overtly white supremacist laws and policies regarding immigration and naturalization. And given that legacy of exclusion, inability for these Japanese immigrants to vote or to have their rights respected, all of their businesses that they started, all of their organizations, the homes that they were able to secure, sometimes having to fight off restrictive covenants, sometimes having to just stay in the segregated ethnic neighborhoods, those could all be uprooted when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 during World War II and forced over 100,000 Japanese Americans, including my mother and her family, into the concentration camps. So, that was a common experience for many Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were the largest group at that time. But after the war, you begin to see more of a bifurcation in the experience. You begin to see more of the class differences amongst Asians being manifest in terms of who has more upward mobility, who has more rights, who's more likely to be tolerated moving into a formerly all-white middle-class neighborhood. And then this is when you get this stereotype of Asian Americans as the model minority. So if the US has moved from a paradigm of Jim Crow segregation towards liberal integration and eventually multiculturalism, the model minority becomes a way to define integration in the form of a submissive assimilation, right? In a form of restoring and reaffirming the white majority, while creating only a limited opening and space for integration in the form of assimilation. So that's what many Japanese Americans in the post-war era were dealing with, this new phenomenon of model minority integration. Of course, there were some that still continued to live in poverty, have working class jobs, and never had those opportunities at all. And that really, I think, sets the stage for the post-1965 immigration of Asian immigrants, and then post-1965, post-1975, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Southeast Asian refugees coming in. An increasing divide between those who are coming to the US with more capital, with more education, with more English language skills, with more ability to get professional jobs or to start businesses, versus the others who are your restaurant workers, your garment workers, cab drivers, domestic workers, the folks working the minimum wage or low wage jobs, increasingly non-unionized jobs, because of the structures of neoliberalism that have really relied heavily on globalization and the globalization of the working class.
I'm glad that that last piece where you began to talk about neoliberalism actually brings me to my second question for each of you. So for at least the last 20 years, I've argued that in 79, 80, that series of recessions laid the groundwork for the shifting of the U.S. economy, its transformation into a capital accumulation structure that was financialized, global, racial capitalism, and that brought with it, and that neoliberal expression that would put an emphasis on tax cuts, deregulation, and privatization, that it plunged the African American community into a new nadir. And what I mean by that is that if you look at quality of life social indicators, that in regard to African Americans, they all stagnated or reversed, with the exception of political representation, right? In fact, I recently saw some data that shows that in 1950, the gap in white male to black male life expectancy in the state of Michigan was 5.6 years. Today, it is nearly 10 years. In terms of women, the gap between black and white women did shrink, but not very much. And so that's what I mean by these life expectancy figures in terms of quality of life. Okay, there's always going to be technological problems. And so my question to you is, if you're looking at Pan-Asian community, how has it fared overall during the consolidation of this neoliberal regime? And are there differences among the particular Asian American communities? And Scott, since Augusto went first initially, why don't you pick up? Because you seem to be headed in the direction of talking about neoliberalism.
Yeah, I think that liberalism in the 1970s is very important. I think I would bring in a couple more points, which I know you're familiar with since you've written about this. I don't think the shift towards neoliberalism was purely an economic shift, right? It was a response to the growing political power of the national liberation movements and the domestic Black power, red power, yellow power, brown power movements. And what these movements did, and I'm drawing a lot upon the work of Emanuel Wallerstein here, is they really disrupted the liberal paradigm that had been in place for so long. And if we think about, the liberal model of capitalism, it was different than the pure model of colonialism, right? That some of the European powers had practiced. The American model was to grant these qualified forms of independence and self-determination. And there was a great book review I was reading about the history of liberalism that said the difference between social liberalism and conservatism is it believed that society could be improved. It believed that there could be, a greater state of equality amongst peoples. The difference between liberalism and socialism is the liberals basically believe we would never get to that point. So liberalism was always about a gradual change and incremental change towards an ultimate state of equality that actually never arrives. The point of liberalism is to continue that ideology and that discourse of reform to make people believe in the system as it actually is, rather than what the radical socialists and communists were promising it could eventually be. And I think that's an important point to realize, that liberal myth of ultimate progress is what really unravels in the 1960s because of the deindustrialization, the outsourcing. You brought up the deunionization campaigns that you brought up, and this shift of capital away from sources of labor power. Obviously, when I study Detroit, you see the shift away from union employment, from manufacturing towards these neoliberal forms of flexible accumulation and global outsourcing. All of that undermines the sources of labor power that had really been essential to, of course, whites moving into the middle class, and had been part of the promise of African American progress moving from the South to northern cities during the Great Migration, right? So I think you see that happening on a national scale, and the shift towards relying more on production in Asia, relying more on Asian immigrant labor and immigrant labor more generally in this country is part of those neoliberal strategies to move away from unionization, to move away from stable contracts and benefits for workers, right? And to have that flexibility for capital. And so I think the difference with Asian Americans is most of the population really takes off after the 1960s. When I was born in 1970, there was only about 1.5 million people of Asian ancestry in this country. Now there's over 20 million, right? And so Asian Americans didn't necessarily lose status for the most part in the neoliberal era. They were coming here as part of an adjustment to it. And so they don't necessarily, they may suffer similar forms of exploitation and oppression, but not necessarily feel that same sense of loss of status that others may be feeling.
Augusto, can you speak to that question as well from the Filipino American experience?
Yeah. Well, first of all, your question is not an academic question for me because the 1980s was a time, of struggle for a lot of people, and it's really amazing how when you hear the Reagan Bush years being touted as great, when I experienced those years as a student activist, fighting all the time, trying to fight for various kinds of union struggles going on, as well as cuts on and the funding for education going on in the state of California as well as federally. And when you talk about the new nadir, it is something that I feel emotionally very strongly, about because of the those things that the neoliberal strategy that you and Scott were talking about has had this impact, a tremendous impact. The deregulation, the corporate flight, all of these things have had a tremendous impact on African American communities and on poor communities, working people, and the decline of unionization. It can only come hand in hand. um, to the growing poverty and miseration of African Americans and many Latinos and working folks in the United States. Um, to the point where I would say that I hope that people would be thinking or trying to imagine, greater expansive solutions to these problems. Um, I've always felt, and maybe it's a whim, that to deal with these massive problems, we need a Marshall Plan here in the United States. And why should the United States empire limit itself to rescuing the European powers after World War II, when there's a tremendous social need to correct the fragmentation, economic, political, social, racial in this country, as well as the whole question about immigration and the fact that the United States has been exploiting, benefiting from the economies of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and not really investing in order to be able to deal with the massive problems of structural inequality there. And I would say that, I think Dr. Kurashige has already started to talk about this with respect to the Asian American community, that the situation for Asian Americans during, if we plot this time period of the New Nadir, has been a very polarized one, in the sense that you do have Asian immigrant entrepreneurs, for example, in Silicon Valley, becoming venture capitalists, trying to chart out new businesses, coming in as very highly skilled technological workers and so forth. But then you also have in the same area, say in Northern California, not that far away in Fresno, you have Hmong and Lao communities that are very, very poor, that live off of welfare as refugees and become involved in gang violence and gangs in order to be able to survive. Um, Working 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to survive. For every Asian American who enters an elite university, you have lots of Asian American students attending community colleges and public state colleges, commuter schools, who not only go to school full time, but also work full time. For every supposed model minority Asian out there, you've got folks working in sweatshop labor, in unpaid or unrecognized or unorganized domestic work, many of them women. And you also have a lot of undocumented people living in the shadows, in fear, and at the same time providing much of the labor in the service areas, the service arena, and in domestic work. So I don't think that I think that the impact of this neoliberal shift in the 80s for Asian Americans has been an extremely polarized one. And so, seeing the community as a model minority is absolutely just a very, very small portion of that. And as Professor Kurashige has already started to talk about, the immigration in the 1960s was also very extremely selective, for bringing in professional workers and people with capital in order to be able to invest here. And so that had also a lot to do, that and a lot of Cold War legislation, even starting from the 1940s and 50s, had a lot to do with reshaping the dynamics of the Asian American community towards this kind of polarization that exists now in our community.
Thank you, Augusto. for those answers. Let me bring Scott back in, and so I want to kind of combine two questions, and we've talked about the period. Now I want to talk specifically about this moment in which we are witnessing. I think in 16 cities, it shows that there's been a 150% increase in anti-Asian violence. And so my two questions are, one, is the violence targeted at a particular ethnic or presumed nationality, or is it pan-Asian? And two, the response on the part of Asian American communities, is the response functioning on the basis of ethnic lines, or is the response to these incidents of racial terrorism pan-Asian?
I would say it's both. Certainly, in this moment, of course, during the Trump presidency or his campaigning before that, and the continued, shift to the far right by the GOP, there's been an extreme xenophobia, an intense scapegoating, and just a normalization of political violence as well, and disenfranchisement. So I think there is that general case. On the other hand, there has been the specific scapegoating of China. I mean, it's so astonishing. In Fort Worth, Texas, there's a special House of Representatives seat that's open because the former Representative Ron Wright died of coronavirus. And there's a Korean American woman running as a MAGA Trump supporter, arguing for a ban on immigration from China. I mean, this is so astonishing. Even this Korean American right winger is running on the Trump rhetoric of a ban on China. So there is a particular way in which East Asians or those perceived to be Chinese or from China are under more scrutiny and attack at this moment compared to, say, during the so-called
Scott, you froze. We'll give it a minute. Augusto, they say that the sin on radio and podcast is dead air. So can you pick up, and I kind of want to add a question in here, that the example that Scott was giving in terms of a Korean American right winger calling for a ban on Chinese immigration. To what extent? Yeah, you're back, Scott. Complete your thought, and then I've got a what do you call it? A subsidiary question based on your answer that I want to throw out. Scott, are you froze again?
Did he freeze again?
Yeah, he's frozen again.
Well,
right.
this
Let me ask a question, Augusto. Koreans have a particular history with Japan and a particular history with China. So to what extent is the anti-Chinese bias amongst this particular Korean person a legacy of a particular history, as opposed to simply just the right-wing stance in terms of pro-MAGA foolishness that she may be taking?
I think in this particular case, it might be coming from the pro-MAGA, ideology that she is taking. I don't think the antagonism between Koreans and Chinese historically is not, at least in the 20th century, has not been as intense as they've been in terms of Korea and Japan, or in the relationship, the Japanese colonialism in Korea. So that would be strange for me, that for it to be coming from that from that perspective. One thing that Professor Kurashige has said is, about this is really not astonishing to me, because when you look at many of these MAGA rallies, even like I was watching some of the YouTube videos coming from Seattle, from Oregon, from San Francisco, even. You have quite a few Asian Americans who are part of that very pro-Trump MAGA, perspective. And I think it does not astonish me at all that he, this kind of anti-Asian terrorism that you've labeled really comes from, that from Trump really manipulating and intensifying the racism, or the racial scapegoating, and creating this particular kind of atmosphere, so that white supremacism, through this anti-Asian scapegoating that he started, has been disseminated to the general population. And I think in many ways people have been affected, be they black, white, brown, Asian, by this kind of atmosphere that Trump had promoted all throughout. I was reading your article. You were writing about the anti-Asian violence back in March or April.
2020.
In 2020.
Yeah.
We had almost an entire year of constant barrage of this kind of discourse and name calling against Asians. And what else can we expect? When the highest office in the land, whether it's a bully pulpit or what, is used in this way to denigrate a particular population. I think we're paying for that now.
Let me see what it says. Let me move. So in terms of the response on the part of Asian Americans, can you speak to some of the specificity of that response? And I'm getting ready to add Professor Kurashige back. All right. So the question concerns some specifics about the fight back. Well, no, let me actually shift here. And I want to raise questions about the historic relationship between the African Americans and particular Asian Americans, but then overall general Asian American communities. And I'm wondering, has that relationship, the extent to which it has been collaborative and has pursued progressive radical politics, has that been specific to particular ethnicities? Has it been broad? Are there periods, historical periods, that we could identify in which there was high-level cooperation and collaboration between African Americans and Asian American communities? And correspondingly, is there a pattern in which we can identify in which there are these moments of sharp antagonism? So I hope the questions make sense. Professor Kurashige, why don't you take that on first, since we were missing your voice?
Yeah, apologies for the technical difficulties. I do think when we look at Black-Asian relations, or we look at cross-racial solidarity more broadly, right? I think a lot of it stems from the international global situation, right? So, Asian American Studies emerges during the Black Power era, during the era of Third World liberation, right? And the first Asian American Studies programs were part of a Third World student strike at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley that involved Black studies, Chicano studies, Native American studies, right? And there were of course folks like the Panthers promoting international solidarity, and there was an international solidarity movement globally through the Bandung Conference, through the Non-Aligned Movement, through the movement for Afro-Asian unity. So I think that played a significant role, right, in shaping the consciousness of people here. We don't have that same level of global solidarity, in fact, there's a lot more global chaos, right, and nationalism than internationalism in the world. So I think that's a factor. I think the other thing that is a big factor is class consciousness, right? And so you had much more during the era of the high period of industrial capitalism, that sense of people working in common workplaces, whether it was, again, in the private sector, in the auto industry, or whether there were a lot more public sector jobs, right, where people were in unions together. And even if they weren't in unions, they worked side by side. They shared that same sense that, we are in a common class situation compared to the bosses, compared to the managers and the capitalists. And this neoliberal gig economy where everyone just has to hustle, right, where you're no longer a worker, you're almost constantly an independent contractor. Or as we saw, in the case of these spa workers, I read that one of them only got 1 day off a month and she worked 12-hour days. They get so isolated, even from the others who share their position, because she was actually living, at many of them were living at the workplace several days a week or more. And that ability, legally to form unions, but that ability to have the leverage as a class to make solidarity meaningful in both material benefits and the kind of emotional bonds that people create. I think, that's obviously there's an attempt to revive that. The Amazon workers, right, in Bessemer, Alabama, are a big part of that. But there's certainly been this shift towards neoliberalism that was very consciously about inhibiting working class solidarity and pitting groups against each other.
Dr. Espiritu, can you take up that same question?
Yeah, I think it's no secret that the times of, in a way, the great internationalism of the 1930s centered around the Communist Party and many of the offshoots of the Communist Party and its work is a major time for a lot of internationalism among African Americans, Asian Americans. I just think about some of the earlier Asian American activists like Carlos Bolosan or Carl Yoneda, and people involved. Carlos Bolosan in America's in the Heart. He makes it a point to centralize the lynching of the black body, as an important symbol, not just for African Americans, but also for Filipino Americans and other Asian Americans who are being targeted and criminalized during this particular time period. Professor Korshige also mentioned the 1960s. The Black Panther Party was really a major center for that internationalism. There were Asian Americans in the Black Panther Party, as you all know, from reading Diane Fujino's book on Richard Aoki, and people that I knew. Many of the Filipino anti-Marcos, anti-dictatorship activists I knew were married to Black Panther officers, and so there was that. And then the offshoots of that from the Red Guard Party among Chinese in San Francisco and New York, and many others, including left groups, IWK. There's people start to come together and really experience African American radical movements. I remember in the 80s, and I'm like a tail end of a lot of moves. I got to see Amiri Baraka, what he represented. He was in the Revolutionary Communist League, the League of Revolutionary Struggle. I mean, he was, these kinds of things were not happening in the mainstream organizing. I think the radical organizing really provided the basis for a lot of these cross-cultural connections and common political struggles. And I should say, like the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 1980s, my generation, to me, it's like deja vu watching Georgia, because in the 1988 primaries, Jesse won the whole Super Tuesday in the South during the primaries, and he was a magnet for the Rainbow Coalition, is a magnet for people of color, all people of color, and to see Georgia go the way of Biden, in this case, particularly with African Americans and even Asian Americans now, in Georgia and Atlanta, was a big source of pride for me, and to see that happen and to see the possibilities of that kind of cross-racial organizing.
So, given that there is, in fact, a legacy of collaborative radical struggle between African Americans and various Asian American communities, the narrative that we've been getting for at least the past few months, if not the past year, has been one that talks about a deep rift amongst African Americans and Asian Americans. And sometimes they point to the case at Harvard, and other times they point to what I think are relatively few African Americans who have participated in anti-Asian violence, such as Brandon Elliott's case. And so my question is, how do we counter and begin to restitch this rich legacy of common struggle, of coalition building, of alliances, of solidarity? And I know Professor Kurashige, in your first book, Shifting Grounds of Race, you tell a lot of amazing stories. It's not just about the high level activists, right? We can always talk about a Du Bois. We can talk about a Grace Lee Boggs. We can do that. But you show that in down on the community level, just regular people building solidarity and common bonds of humanity. So what ideas do you have about how we reknit that solidarity?
Thank you. I mean, I think there are definitely some really troubling incidents, right? And there are certainly tensions that we don't want to try to sugarcoat. I think we want to start, though, by putting things in proper context, right? I mean, we in this country right now have a party that has embraced voter suppression.
Okay. Dr. Espiritu, can you jump in on that question?
Yeah, I think that for me, if I recall, are you back?
Maybe I try to finish point before I go. I was going to say there's actually been in the face of hard shift in nationalism, suppression, authoritarianism, a pretty
He's not completely bad. Okay. Dr. Spiritu, why don't
Well, I know part of perhaps the context that Professor Kurashige is talking about is this the Republican Party and this promotion of white supremacy coming from that party that provides the context and the atmosphere for the interracial, interethnic relations that we have now. And so I think I agree, if that's what he was saying, that's a very important thing for us to address, you know. But you're back. So yeah.
So Dr. Kurashige, why don't you complete your thought, and then we'll go back to Dr. Spiritu and let him kind of bring it all together.
I was going to say, solidarity is not at the level we need anywhere in this country to bring about social transformation to the end of this oppressive system. But in the face of a party going full white nationalist and authoritarianism, and pushing voter suppression, there's actually been a surge in solidarity between, for instance, Black and Asian American voters in Georgia. Mm-hmm. The Asian American vote doubled from 2016 to 2020. A lot of it had to do with the cooperative work that Asian American community writers are doing with Stacey Abrams, and her crew, mobilizing Black voters and registering Black people to vote. Right. So I think when you see these voter suppression moves in Georgia, my state of Texas just put out the new ones, that's really going to create more of a basis for that solidarity. Now, that's not at the same level of solidarity that, led to the creation of ethnic studies, through student strikes in the 1960s. But it sure is a lot different than what we're seeing, in terms of white, non-white relations, right? Where the majority of white people actually not only are voting for Trump, but actually think whites are the most discriminated against group in the country, right? So that's a part of it. The other thing, though, is we're seeing these incidents, the Brandon Elliott incident against the 65-year-old Filipino American woman in New York City, Manhattan. I mean, he was someone who was homeless. He's been reported to have been mentally ill. And he actually stabbed his own mother to death in 2002. So there's a level of pain and healing. There's a need to address more resources for housing and healthcare, right? And that sense of pain, which is disproportionately being felt by working class Black and brown people, right, is something we need to get at in order to create healthier communities, in order to create what my mentor Ron Scott, the co-founder of the Detroit chapter of the Black Panther Party, called peace zones for life, right? We need a holistic approach to healthy communities in the inner city urban areas where so many people, as you pointed out, particularly African Americans, have been structurally unemployed and denied resources for far too long.
Thank you for that answer. And Dr. Spiritu, you can pick up for your talk about efforts to build solidarity.
Well, I am not gonna add too much more to that. I think that is very, very well put. I would just say I think that we really do need to build on the strengths of the kind of inter-ethnic collaborations that happened out of this last elections, particularly out of Georgia. I think there are a lot of commonalities and solidarities that are, between Asian American and African Americans that are not recorded, in the media or not attended to in the media on a day-to-day basis. I know Professor Kurashige talks about food and people sharing, food together. In African Americans having Japanese food, Japanese American eating soul food, like those kinds of day-to-day relations. I can talk about how South Asian Americans, Filipino Americans take to hip hop, and those kinds of youth cultures and solidarities that from musical and cultural collaborations to political collaborations that have been emerging out of those kinds of solidarities. So I think we're up against a lot of negativity in the media. I think maybe we should be talking or thinking about why it is that this is such a favorite trope, in the media to always present Asian Americans and African Americans being against each other. I think there's a particular form of racism involved in that kind of pathologizing of both communities, as if we have a natural propensity to hate each other, and then sort of hiding, all of this history, of common struggle, of common humanity that Professor Kurashige talks about.
That final comment that you made, Dr. Espiritu, brings me to the reason we are doing what we call Black Power Media. Our goal is to have radical, revolutionary programming 24 hours a day, right? B-span. It's going to be all Black news, speaking to the radical transformation of this society 24 hours a day.
Right.
And so I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. And I want to give you guys a chance to, for any kind of final comments that you would want to say to our audience.
Okay, so I just want to again thank you for having this conversation. I think, the idea of a B-span network is so important because, there are so many in the mainstream media finally catching on to some of these stories, but still stuck in old frames and ways of thinking. And then when you go on social media where there is, more participation, I've just seen so many of these fake accounts and bots that are spreading overt white supremacy, pitting Asians against Blacks. Literally, I saw this one account that has only one follower, and they left the same comment 50 times in a row, trying to stir up, anti-Black sentiment among Asians or anti-Asian sentiment among Black folk. So there are tensions, but again, when we see again these incidents of street crime like that, we know that we can take a transformative justice abolitionist approach to addressing problems of violence and crime. We've had our sisters in the domestic and intimate partner violence movement through organizations like Insight showing us the way to think about non-carceral real solutions to these issues of violence. And so, that's one example. I think the other thing I would say is that, that we know that that there is a system of white supremacy, right, that affects all of us, that makes us hate ourselves, makes us hate others who seem to be advancing ahead of us. I think that's at the root of this, small group of elites Asians trying to get into Harvard and Yale and working with Edward Bloom. Edward Bloom has been one of the major lawyers pushing voter suppression in my state of Texas and elsewhere. He was part of, these lawsuits that led to Shelby versus Holder, right? So this is a very clear, agenda that the right wing has to pit us against each other, to have us fighting over crumbs, right? And to restore a white Christian nationalism that has been, the dominant ideology, but now is really starting to crack and fracture because of changing demographics, changing, again, populations, impacting electoral politics, and also making changes at the community level. I'll hand it over from there.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that wonderful answer. Dr. Espiritu.
Well, Dr. Chajua, I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity. I hope that your listeners really are able to get something out of something valuable out of what we said. It is certainly valuable for me to be part of this conversation, because I think, we can't exclude ourselves. We're part of that change that we want to see. I mean, that you taking the opportunity or taking this, this effort to really bring us together to talk today is part of that change. And I myself am not part of Facebook. I don't have really any plans to in the near future. And part of my objection to that is the kind of sort of very superficial, kind of conversations that I'm seeing my colleagues and other friends, family become involved in. And I prefer this. If we're going to have dialogue, I prefer that we have, meaningful dialogue. And hopefully, what happened in Georgia this past year could be a model for a continuation of work and understanding between Asian American and African American communities. And I hope too that we really work on the social class issues that really affect all of us. And I'm thinking about labor and about the Amazon struggle, that I hope that we can all support and get behind the workers there and trying to grapple with one of the biggest, multinationals out there. It's amazing how little significance is attached to this in the U.S. media. I mean, I was reading a French newspaper. Front and center was the Bessemer issue, saying this is one of the most significant labor issues and struggles of our time. And I think, African Americans were central to that organizing. So I hope that we could have more of that and bring together, our common interests in racial and class struggles, gender struggles as well. I'm very, very excited about that. I'm very happy and hope that we could continue the dialogue. So more power to you with the show. And
Could I just give one shout out to the activists who've mobilized around Asians for Black Lives? Of course, all of this is happening while Derek Chauvin is on trial for murder, and we can't forget the centrality of police terror, right, to white supremacy. And so, in Minneapolis in particular, Asian American activists have showed up working in solidarity and coordination with Black Lives Matter activists. They've also done in Oakland, Los Angeles, San Diego, other cities around the country, right? And I think that's important, not because they represent everybody, but the people that represent true change never represent the majority right away. As Grace Lee Boggs says, the initial solutions put forward by movement builders oftentimes seem too extreme and too radical. If they don't, then they don't represent meaningful change. They don't really represent the need for a movement, right? And so, I think those folks who have been holding it down for Asians for Black Lives, working in solidarity with folks across race, particularly with Black Lives Matters, are so important to modeling the type of behavior that can catalyze a much bigger movement. Because what we're seeing in this moment is Asian Americans have been silenced for so long, have been denied our opportunity to study our own history, let alone Black people's history, that this really is an awakening moment for so many people to make a big paradigm shift, to realize things have to change. I mean, yesterday, a group of Asian American CEOs took out an ad saying enough is enough. We want an end to racism. We're going to invest in progressive community activist organizations and Asian American studies. And they put a quote by Grace Lee Boggs in the center of this full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal. Now, who would have ever thought that would have happened, right? And again, that doesn't mean automatic change, but it means there are stirrings of some dramatic change that are afoot right now.
No, absolutely. What you just spoke to, Dr. Kurosigi, is that in this moment, those things that appeared to be too radical are now becoming reasonable because of the level of immiseration, the level of brutality and cruelty. When you lean your knee on the neck of a human being for 9 minutes and 30 seconds, that's a level of just cruelty and evil. So yes, we're at a moment where new possibilities are emerging. And let me thank you both, colleagues and comrades, for coming on the second
Thank you.
episode
Thank
of the
you. Thank you.
podcast. So, thank you so much.
All right.
This has been Real Talk with Dr. Sundiata Kaita Chajua, and it has been a magnificent conversation. And I want to say thank you and good